Every great idea you've ever had at work probably died in a meeting room, surrounded by people who smiled, nodded, and slowly sanded every sharp edge off it until what remained was beige. You felt this, the slow deflation of watching something bold get workshopped into something safe. And the cost isn't just one lost idea, it's that the people with the best ideas eventually stop offering them. A camel, the old joke goes, is a horse designed by a committee. The joke works because everyone has lived it. You walk into a room with a clear proposal. 12 people weigh in. Each person adds a small, reasonable modification. Each modification makes individual sense, and somehow the sum of all those reasonable inputs produces something no single person would have chosen. The output is compromise shaped like a product. So what's actually happening in that room? Why does aggregating smart people so reliably produce dumb results? The first problem is older than corporate culture. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch ran a series of experiments where participants were asked to compare line lengths. Simple visual task, obvious answers. But when Confederates in the room deliberately chose the wrong line, about a third of real participants went along with the group. They could see the right answer, they chose the wrong one anyway. The pressure to conform operated below conscious awareness. Participants reported genuinely doubting their own perception. A room full of people generates its own gravity, and that gravity pulls toward the center. This gets worse when stakes rise. Irving Janis studied the Bay of Pigs invasion, one of the most catastrophic foreign policy decisions in American history. President Kennedy's advisory team was packed with brilliant minds. Individually, several of them had serious reservations about the plan. In the room, those reservations evaporated. Janis coined the term groupthink for what happened. A collective drift toward consensus, where dissent feels like disloyalty. The group's desire to maintain harmony overrode its ability to evaluate reality. Smart people, terrible outcome. The intelligence was there. The structure crushed it. But conformity pressure is only the surface layer. Something more mechanical happens when groups make decisions, and it explains why even well-intentioned committees trend toward the average. Consider what information actually gets discussed in a meeting. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that groups spend most of their time talking about information everyone already shares. Shared knowledge dominates the conversation because it feels validating. When 3 people know the same fact, mentioning it gets nods. Unique information, the kind only one person holds, tends to get mentioned briefly, then buried. The group converges on what's common rather than what's complete. The very structure of discussion filters out the insights that could change the outcome. This is called the common knowledge effect, and it has a brutal implication. The whole point of putting diverse people in a room is to access diverse information. The meeting format systematically prevents exactly that. You've assembled a team of specialists, then created conditions where they mostly discuss what the generalist already knew. Now layer in status dynamics. Who speaks first in your meetings? Usually the highest-ranking person. Research consistently shows that early contributions anchor the entire discussion. Once a direction is established in the first few minutes, subsequent speakers adjust their input to align with that anchor. A junior analyst with a better framework sits quietly because the VP already staked a position. The hierarchy doesn't need to be enforced. Everyone enforces it on themselves. There's a name for the pattern that emerges: authority bias cascading through sequential speech. Each person calibrates their contribution based on what's already been said, and what's already been said was calibrated to whoever spoke first. By the time the conversation reaches the person with the freshest perspective, the conversational train has left the station. They can wave from the platform or jog alongside. They rarely redirect the route, and the mediocrity compounds through another mechanism most people miss entirely. Groups don't just average out quality, they actively penalize the unusual. Behavioral economists call this the penalty of distinctiveness. When someone proposes something unexpected, the group has to work harder to evaluate it. Familiar proposals get processed fluently. They feel right because they feel easy. A genuinely original idea creates cognitive friction, and in a group setting, friction gets interpreted as risk. The bold proposal loses to the familiar one because familiarity masquerades as wisdom. You've watched this happen. Someone pitches something unconventional. The room goes quiet for half a beat too long. Then someone says, "That's interesting, but," and pivots to a safer version. The original pitcher reads the room. softens their stance, and by the end, the group has selected the option that made everyone least uncomfortable. Least uncomfortable. That's the actual selection criterion in most group decisions. This is why design by committee produces cars that look like every other car, buildings that look like every other building, and corporate strategies that read like they were generated by the same consulting firm. The process optimizes for consensus, and consensus is the mathematical enemy of originality. Original ideas, by definition, sit outside a cluster. The group's center of gravity can never land on an outlier. The Apollo program offers a revealing counterexample. NASA's Mission Control had dozens of specialists working together, and the results were the opposite of mediocre. The difference was structural. Each controller had absolute authority over their domain. Flight Director Gene Kranz didn't run a committee. He ran a system where one person owned each decision, and the group's role was to feed information to that person, not to vote on the outcome. Accountability was individual, input was collective. That architecture inverted the usual committee dynamic. The group made each person sharper instead of blander. The military learned something similar through centuries of costly mistakes. The commander's intent model gives a leader clear decision authority, then distributes execution. Everyone knows the goal. One person decides the plan. The group executes, adapts, and feeds information upward. Compare this to a corporate strategy meeting, where 12 people debate the goal, the plan, and the execution simultaneously, with no one person accountable for the final call. The committee structure diffuses responsibility until it belongs to no one, and decisions owned by no one tend to be defended by no one. So why do organizations keep defaulting to committees? Because committees serve a function that has nothing to do with decision quality. They distribute blame. When a committee decides no individual failed, the group absorbs the accountability like a sponge absorbs water, spreading it so thin it practically disappears. For career-conscious managers, this is a feature. The meeting that produces a mediocre outcome also produces perfect cover. Nobody signed their name to it. Everybody signed their name to it. Same thing. This creates a selection pressure that quietly shapes entire organizations. People who make bold individual calls occasionally fail visibly. People who route everything through committees fail invisibly. Over time, the committee routers survive and the bold decision makers get culled. The organization evolves toward process over judgment, and the process has a built-in bias toward the unremarkable. There's a fix, but it requires accepting something uncomfortable. The research on group decision-making points in one direction with striking consistency. Groups are excellent at gathering information and terrible at integrating it into a decision. The optimal structure separates those two functions completely. Use the group for input. Assign the decision to an individual. Make that individual publicly accountable for the outcome. Amazon's single-threaded owner model runs on this principle. One person owns the decision. They gather input from everyone relevant, often through written memos that force structured thinking before the meeting even starts. The meeting becomes a discussion of a specific proposal, authored by a specific person, who will live with the consequences. The group sharpens the thinking. One person decides. Critics point out that individual decision-makers have their own biases: anchoring, overconfidence, availability heuristic. This is true. A single person can be spectacularly wrong, but the research suggests that individual errors are more detectable and more correctable than group errors. When one person makes a bad call, the failure has a return address. When a committee makes a bad call, the post-mortem produces another committee. You've sat in those rooms. You've felt your own best thinking slowly dissolve into the group's comfortable middle. You've watched someone's eyes dim when they realized their idea was about to be averaged into oblivion. That feeling, that specific deflation, is the sound of an organization choosing safety over signal. The next time you're in a meeting where everyone agrees too quickly, pay attention to what was lost in the first 5 minutes. The best idea in the room is usually the one that made everyone briefly uncomfortable. It got a polite nod, a gentle redirect, and a quiet burial under 6 layers of consensus. The committee moved on. The camel walked out the door.